The morning sun cast golden rays through the large windows of Los Angeles International Airport in 1971. Jessica Williams, a 19-year-old black college student with bright eyes and determination in her steps, walked through the busy terminal, clutching her small suitcase and ticket. This was her first time flying, and excitement mixed with nervousness made her heart beat faster. Jessica had saved money for 6 months, working evenings at a local diner after her classes at community college. The trip to New York to visit her grandmother, who had raised her but moved east 3 years ago, meant everything to her. Her grandmother was turning 70, and Jessica wouldn't miss it for the world. Flight 302 to New York, now boarding at Gate 14, announced the overhead speaker. Jessica checked her ticket again and headed toward the gate. She joined the line of passengers, mostly businessmen in suits and a few families going on vacation. Jessica wore her nicest dress, a simple blue cotton outfit her grandmother had made for her high school graduation. "Ticket, please," said the gate agent with a quick glance and an even quicker smile. Jessica handed over her ticket, received her boarding pass, and walked down the jetway. The smell of airplane fuel and the sound of engines filled her senses. "Welcome aboard," greeted a stewardess at the entrance to the plane. Jessica smiled back and made her way through the narrow aisle, counting the rows until she found her seat, 24C, by the window. Jessica had never seen the country from above. As she settled into her seat, she imagined the patchwork of land and cities she would soon see. She carefully placed her small purse under the seat in front of her, just as the safety instructions had shown in the pamphlet. Meanwhile, in a different part of the airport, Clint Eastwood walked quietly toward the same flight. He wore sunglasses and a simple jacket, trying not to draw attention. The actor had just finished filming Dirty Harry, which would soon make him even more famous than he already was. But today, he wasn't looking for attention. He just wanted a peaceful flight to New York for meetings about his next project. "Mr. Eastwood, welcome aboard. We have you in first class, seat 3A, said the chief stewardess with a bright smile. Unlike the brief acknowledgement Jessica had received, the staff rolled out invisible red carpets for Eastwood. He nodded politely, removed his sunglasses, and found his spacious seat at the front of the plane. Back in economy class, the seats around Jessica filled up quickly. A middle-aged couple sat beside her, giving her a brief nod before turning to their magazines. Jessica pulled out the book she had brought for the long flight. "I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings" by Maya Angelou. "This is your captain speaking. We're expecting a smooth flight to New York today, with an estimated flying time of 5 hours and 30 minutes. The weather looks good all the way through. Please listen as our cabin crew explains the safety features of this aircraft." As the plane taxied toward the runway, Jessica looked out the window, watching the ground crew become smaller and smaller. Her grandmother's face appeared in her mind, and she smiled thinking about their reunion. The stewardess named Karen Mercer moved through the aisles, checking that seatbelts were fastened. When she reached Jessica's row, she frowned slightly. "Make sure that's tight," she said curtly, pointing to Jessica's seatbelt before moving on with a much warmer smile for the couple next to her. Jessica didn't think much of it. She was too excited about the trip, the flight, and seeing her grandmother. As the engines roared and the plane lifted off the ground, Jessica gripped the armrests tightly. The sensation of taking off made her stomach flip, but soon she relaxed as the plane leveled out above the clouds. Little did Jessica know that this flight would become more than just her first time in the air. In a few hours, she would find herself at the center of an incident that would connect her life with one of Hollywood's biggest stars and change her perspective forever. In first class, Eastwood settled in with a script his agent had given him to read. He ordered a coffee and began making notes in the margins, completely unaware that later in this journey, his actions would make a difference in a young woman's life and become a story retold for years to come. The plane soared higher, leaving Los Angeles behind, carrying all its passengers toward New York, and toward an unexpected confrontation that would soon unfold at 30,000 feet. The plane had been in the air for about 2 hours when Jessica felt a chill. The air conditioning blew directly overhead, making goosebumps rise on her arms. She looked around and noticed several passengers wrapped in thin gray blankets provided by the airline. Jessica pressed the call button above her seat. After a few minutes, Karen Mercer, the stewardess with perfectly styled blonde hair and a tight smile, appeared at her row. "Can I help you?" Karen asked, her voice clipped and professional. "Could I have a blanket, please?" It's a bit cold, Jessica requested politely. Karen's smile tightened further. I'm sorry, we're out of blankets, she said without a moment's hesitation. They're only available for longer flights anyway. Jessica nodded and thanked her, though confusion crossed her face. She had clearly seen other passengers with blankets. Still, she didn't want to cause trouble. She returned to her book, pulling her thin cardigan closer around her shoulders. 10 minutes later, Jessica looked up from her reading when she heard Karen's friendly voice a few rows ahead. Would anyone like coffee, tea, or a blanket? The stewardess asked, her tone warm and inviting, completely different from how she had spoken to Jessica. Jessica watched as Karen handed blankets to an older white couple sitting 3 rows ahead. They hadn't even asked for them. The stewardess was offering them freely, despite telling Jessica there were none available. Jessica sat quietly for another 15 minutes, thinking about what to do. She didn't want to create a scene, but the unfairness of the situation bothered her. Finally, when Karen passed by her row again, Jessica raised her hand gently. Excuse me, Jessica said softly. I noticed you're giving out blankets to other passengers. I'm still quite cold. Could I please have one? Karen's smile disappeared instantly. As I told you before, we don't have any more blankets, she said, her voice now sharp enough that passengers in nearby seats turned to look. I'm sorry, but I just saw you give blankets to other people after you told me there weren't any, Jessica replied, still keeping her voice calm and respectful. Karen's face flushed red. Are you calling me a liar? She demanded, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Jessica's eyes widened. No, not at all. I'm just confused about the blanket situation. You know what? You're being disruptive, Karen said, placing her hands on her hips. I've been a stewardess for 11 years, and I know disruptive behavior when I see it. In first class, Clint Eastwood was reviewing his script pages when he heard the commotion. Though the curtain separated the cabins, Karen's voice had risen enough to carry forward. He glanced up, but then returned to his work, assuming it was a routine disagreement. Back in economy, passengers were now openly watching the exchange. The couple sitting next to Jessica looked uncomfortable but said nothing. I'm not trying to be disruptive, Jessica explained. I just asked about a blanket because I'm cold. Karen leaned closer. Listen here, she said in a lower voice that still carried to nearby rows. You people are always looking for special treatment. If you can't follow the rules like everyone else, maybe you shouldn't be flying. Jessica felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. You people? She repeated quietly, the meaning of the phrase perfectly clear to her. Karen straightened up and announced loudly, if you continue to be difficult, I'll have to report this to the captain. We can make an emergency landing if a passenger becomes a threat to flight safety. An older white man across the aisle frowned. She just asked for a blanket, he said. How is that threatening flight safety? Karen shot him a look. Sir, please don't involve yourself. I'm handling a situation with an uncooperative passenger. Jessica sat perfectly still, her book forgotten in her lap. This was supposed to be an exciting trip to see her grandmother, and now she was being threatened with removal from the plane for simply asking for a blanket that others had received. I think I'll need to speak with the captain about moving you to another seat, Karen declared, looking down at Jessica, or possibly having you removed at our next scheduled stop in Chicago. Jessica felt tears forming but fought to hold them back. She wouldn't give Karen the satisfaction of seeing her cry. What rule did I break? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Questioning crew member instructions is against airline policy, Karen replied immediately. I'll be back after I speak with the captain. As Karen marched toward the front of the plane, whispers spread through the cabin. Some passengers looked away, pretending not to notice, while others exchanged concerned glances. Little did Jessica know that Karen's trip to the front of the plane would bring her situation to the attention of. Karen Mercer stormed toward the front of the plane, her uniform shoes clicking loudly against the floor. Her face showed anger as she pushed through the curtains separating economy from first class. She headed straight for the small galley area where the flight crew prepared drinks and meals. Jessica sat in her seat, feeling all eyes on her. Some passengers stared openly while others pretended to read or sleep. The couple next to her shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Jessica wished she could disappear. This trip that she had saved for and looked forward to was turning into a nightmare. What did you do? A young boy asked loudly from the row behind her. His mother quickly shushed him. Nothing, Jessica whispered, more to herself than to the boy. She looked out the window at the endless sky, wondering if she would really be put off the plane in Chicago. In the front galley, Karen spoke in urgent tones to the chief stewardess, a woman named Diane who had 20 years of experience. "I have an unruly passenger in row 24, Karen explained, her voice sharp. "She's questioning my authority and creating a disturbance. I want her moved or removed at our next stop." Diane raised an eyebrow. What exactly happened? "She demanded a blanket when I told her we were out. Then she accused me of lying when she saw other passengers with blankets," Karen said. "She's being hostile and disruptive." Clint Eastwood, sitting in seat 3A, couldn't help overhearing. His seat was close to the galley, and though Karen was trying to keep her voice down, her anger made her words carry. He set down his script and listened more carefully. "She really needs to be moved. She's making other passengers uncomfortable," Karen continued. "I think we should radio ahead to Chicago and have her removed from the flight." Diane looked concerned. "Removed? That's serious, Karen. Is she threatening anyone?" "Not directly, but she's challenging my authority. You know that's against airline rules." At this moment, Eastwood decided to get up. He casually walked to the water fountain near the galley, pretending to need a drink while actually trying to learn more about the situation. Back in economy class, an older black woman from a few rows behind came and sat in the empty aisle seat next to Jessica. The couple in Jessica's row had quietly moved to open seats elsewhere. "I'm Margaret," the woman said kindly. "Don't you worry, I heard everything, and you didn't do anything wrong." Jessica gave her a grateful smile. "I don't understand what happened. I just asked for a blanket." "Some people look for reasons to be unkind," Margaret said, patting Jessica's hand. "I've been flying since they first allowed us to be passengers instead of just serving food, and some things haven't changed much." In the galley, Diane was asking more questions about the incident when she noticed Clint Eastwood standing nearby. "Mr. Eastwood, can I help you with something?" she asked professionally. Eastwood smiled his famous half-smile. "Just getting some water," he said, filling a cup. But he didn't return to his seat. Instead, he stayed, listening to more of Karen's complaints. "The girl in 24C needs to be dealt with," Karen insisted. "We can't have passengers questioning crew members." "What did this passenger do exactly?" Eastwood suddenly asked, his voice calm but carrying the natural authority that made him famous in his Western roles. Karen looked startled. "Mr. Eastwood, this is a crew matter." "I understand," he said, "but I couldn't help overhearing. You want to put someone off the plane for asking for a blanket." Karen's face flushed. It wasn't what she asked for, it was how she asked. Diane looked uncomfortable. "Karen, perhaps I should speak with this passenger myself." "I'd like to see what's happening too," Eastwood said, his voice making it clear this wasn't just a suggestion. Back in economy, the situation was getting worse. Another stewardess had come to speak with Jessica, asking for her boarding pass and ID. "Am I in trouble?" Jessica asked, her hands trembling slightly as she handed over her documents. "We're just following procedure," the stewardess replied without warmth. Passengers who had been pretending not to notice the situation now stared openly. Some nudged each other and pointed. A few even took out cameras, but Eastwood paid them no attention. His focus was entirely on understanding what was happening to the young woman in row 24C. As they moved down the aisle toward Jessica, the entire cabin fell silent. Even the usual airplane sounds, the hum of engines, the occasional clink of ice in glasses, seemed to fade away. All eyes followed the unexpected trio making their way through economy class. Jessica looked up, her eyes widening as she recognized the famous actor walking toward her seat. She had no idea why Clint Eastwood was involved or what would happen next. The entire cabin watched as Clint Eastwood, Diane, and Karen approached Jessica's row. Some passengers craned their necks to see better. Others pretended to be absorbed in magazines while stealing glances at the famous actor. The plane seemed to grow quieter than usual, as if the engines themselves were curious about what would happen next. Jessica sat up straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She felt like she was in trouble at school, waiting outside the principal's office. Margaret, the older black woman who had come to sit beside her, stayed put, her presence providing silent support. Is this the passenger? Diane asked Karen, looking at Jessica with a neutral expression. Yes, Karen replied sharply. This is the one causing problems. Clint Eastwood studied Jessica's face. He saw no anger or aggression there, only confusion and worry. He had played enough characters who stood up against injustice to recognize it when he saw it in real life. Young lady, Diane began, I understand there's been some issue about a blanket. Before Jessica could answer, Karen interrupted. She accused me of lying and refusing service to her. She's been argumentative and disruptive. Eastwood raised an eyebrow at Karen's interruption but said nothing yet. He was observing, gathering information like the detective characters he sometimes played. May I explain what happened? Jessica asked quietly. Diane nodded. Please do. I asked for a blanket because I was cold, Jessica explained, her voice steady despite her nervousness. Miss Mercer told me there weren't any left. A few minutes later, I saw her giving blankets to other passengers. When I asked again, she became angry and said I was being disruptive. Several nearby passengers nodded in agreement. One man a few rows ahead turned around. That's exactly what happened. I saw the whole thing. Karen's face flushed red. These passengers don't understand airline procedures. Some blankets are reserved for. For whom? Eastwood spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but firm. The cabin grew even more silent as he spoke. Karen turned to him, clearly surprised that he was questioning her. Mr. Eastwood, with all due respect, this is an airline matter. I'm just asking a simple question, he replied, his famous intensity now focused entirely on Karen. You told this young woman there were no blankets, then gave blankets to other passengers. I'd like to understand why. Diane looked uncomfortably between Karen and Eastwood. As chief stewardess, she needed to support her staff, but she was also beginning to suspect that something wasn't right. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding, Diane suggested diplomatically. There's no misunderstanding, said Margaret from beside Jessica. I've been flying since the 1950s. I know what I saw. Other voices joined in now. A businessman across the aisle spoke up. The stewardess definitely gave blankets to the couple in row 21 right after telling this young lady there weren't any. And she was much friendlier to them, added a woman a few rows back. Karen began to look trapped. She glanced down the aisle as if planning an escape route. Eastwood's eyes narrowed slightly. In his recent film Dirty Harry, he had played a detective who could spot a lie from a mile away. He didn't need to be a detective now to see what was really happening. I've been sitting in first class, Eastwood said calmly, where there are plenty of extra blankets. I noticed that everyone up there who wanted one got one. There seems to be no shortage. Diane looked at Karen with new suspicion. Is that true? Do we have extra blankets? Karen shifted her weight from one foot to the other. We need to keep some in reserve for. For who? Eastwood asked again. I'm curious about airline policy. Are blankets distributed based on some sort of passenger classification? The way he emphasized classification made his meaning clear to everyone listening. This wasn't about blankets. This was about something much deeper. Jessica sat quietly, watching this famous man she had only seen in movies standing up for her. She hadn't asked for this attention. She had only wanted to be treated fairly, like any other passenger. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Passengers who had been napping were now wide awake. Those who had been ignoring the situation couldn't pretend anymore. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. Diane made a decision. Karen, please go to the forward galley and count our blanket inventory. I'd like an exact number. As Karen reluctantly moved away, Diane turned to Jessica. I'd apologize for any misunderstanding. I'll personally bring you a blanket right away. Eastwood hadn't moved. His presence remained a powerful force in the narrow airplane aisle. He watched Karen walk away, then turned his attention back to Jessica. Are you all right? He asked, his voice gentler now. Karen disappeared toward the front of the plane, her face a mixture of anger and embarrassment. The atmosphere in the cabin remained tense. Passengers watched Clint Eastwood, still standing in the aisle next to Jessica's row, with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Some whispered to each other behind cupped hands, while others openly stared. Diane, the chief stewardess, cleared her throat. Mr. Eastwood, thank you for your concern, but I can handle the situation from here. Eastwood didn't move. "I'd like to make sure this young lady is treated fairly," he said. His voice was calm but firm, like the characters he played in his films. "It seems there's been a problem with that so far." Jessica looked up at him, still surprised that someone famous would take an interest in her situation. "Thank you," she said softly. Margaret, the older black woman sitting beside Jessica, nodded in approval. "It's good to see someone with influence speaking up," she said. The captain's voice suddenly came over the intercom, making everyone jump slightly. "This is your captain speaking. We've received information about some turbulence ahead. All passengers and crew should return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts." Diane looked relieved at this interruption. "Mr. Eastwood, you heard the captain. We all need to return to our seats." Eastwood didn't budge. "Is there really turbulence, or is this an attempt to end our conversation?" A murmur ran through the cabin. Passengers looked at each other with raised eyebrows. Was Clint Eastwood accusing the flight crew of lying? The captain's voice came back on. "Crew members, please confirm all passengers are seated with seatbelts fastened." Eastwood finally took a small step back, but he wasn't giving up. "I'd like to speak with the captain after we're through this turbulence," he said to Diane. "I think he should know what's happening on his airplane." Diane nodded stiffly. "I'll let him know." She turned to Jessica. "I'll bring you a blanket as soon as it's safe to move around the cabin." Then she headed back toward the front of the plane. Eastwood leaned down close to Jessica's seat. "Don't worry," he said quietly. "This isn't over." Then he straightened up and returned to first class. As promised, the plane hit a patch of turbulence about 5 minutes later. It wasn't severe, but it was enough to justify the captain's warning. Jessica held tight to her armrests, more from the tension of the situation than fear of the bumpy air. Margaret patted her hand. "You're doing just fine, honey. That man standing up for you, that's something special. Not many celebrities would get involved like that." Jessica nodded. "I didn't expect any of this. I just wanted a blanket because I was cold." "Sometimes the smallest things show the biggest truths," Margaret replied wisely. After about 20 minutes, the "fasten seatbelts" sign went off with a soft ding. Almost immediately, Diane appeared with a gray blanket, which she handed to Jessica with a polite smile. "Here you are," she said. "I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier." Jessica accepted the blanket with a quiet thank you. But it wasn't really about the blanket anymore. It was about being treated differently because of her race, something Jessica had experienced before but never expected so openly on a public airplane flight. A few minutes later, Karen reappeared in the economy cabin. She moved through the aisle without looking at Jessica, serving drinks to passengers with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. The atmosphere remained awkward. Passengers watched her every move, many of them whispering comments to their neighbors. In first class, Clint Eastwood had requested to speak with the captain. The co-pilot had come out briefly to say the captain was busy flying the plane but would try to speak with him later. Eastwood wasn't satisfied with this answer. He wrote a note on a piece of paper and asked that it be delivered to the captain immediately. Back in economy, Jessica wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. It provided warmth, but she couldn't relax. She kept wondering what would happen next. Would Karen try to have her removed in Chicago anyway? Would Clint Eastwood really talk to the captain? Would any of this make a difference? Margaret seemed to read her thoughts. "That actor isn't going to let this drop," she said confidently. "I've seen all his movies. He plays men who stand up for what's right. Seems like he's that way in real life too." A flight attendant who wasn't Karen approached their row. "Miss Williams?" she said to Jessica. Jessica looked up nervously. "Yes." "The captain would like to speak with you. Would you please come with me?" Whispers spread through the cabin as Jessica stood up. Margaret gave her an encouraging nod. "Head high, girl. You did nothing wrong." As Jessica followed the flight attendant toward the front of the plane, she wondered what would happen next. Jessica followed the flight attendant toward the front of the plane. Every step felt like walking through thick mud. Her legs were heavy with anxiety. Passengers watched her pass, some with sympathy in their eyes, others with curiosity. A few nodded encouragingly. "The captain wants to see me," Jessica asked quietly as they approached the cockpit door. "Yes," the flight attendant replied. Her name tag read Susan, and her expression was kind, unlike Karen's had been. "Don't worry, you're not in trouble." Before they reached the cockpit, Susan guided Jessica into the small first-class cabin. There, sitting in the front row, was Clint Eastwood. He stood up when he saw her. Next to him was a man in a pilot's uniform with 4 stripes on his shoulders, the captain. "Miss Williams," the captain said, extending his hand. "I'm Captain Robert Davis. Please, have a seat." He gestured to an empty first-class seat across from them. Jessica sat down, feeling out of place in the luxurious leather seat. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. She had never expected to sit in first class, let alone speak with the captain and a famous movie star. "I understand there was an incident," Captain Davis began. His voice was deep and authoritative, but not unkind. "Mr. Eastwood here has brought some concerns to my attention." Jessica glanced at Eastwood, who gave her a reassuring nod. "Yes, sir," she replied. "There was a misunderstanding about a blanket." The captain frowned slightly. "Mr. Eastwood suggests it might have been more than a misunderstanding. He believes you were treated unfairly." Jessica looked down at her hands. Should she speak honestly? Would it make things worse? She took a deep breath and decided to tell the truth. "The stewardess, Ms. Mercer, told me there were no blankets available. Then I saw her giving blankets to other passengers. When I asked again, she became angry and threatened to have me removed from the plane in Chicago." Captain Davis's frown deepened. "And you believe this treatment was because?" "Because I'm black, sir," Jessica said quietly but firmly. "I've experienced this kind of thing before, but never on an airplane." Eastwood leaned forward. "I watched how this situation unfolded, Captain. There's no doubt in my mind what was happening. Your stewardess was discriminating against this young woman." Captain Davis rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "That's a serious accusation." "It's also illegal," Eastwood added. "The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination in public accommodations, and she hadn't expected him to know about civil rights laws." The captain nodded slowly. "You're right, of course." He turned to Jessica. "Miss Williams, I want to apologize on behalf of the airline. This kind of behavior is not what we stand for." "Thank you," Jessica replied, relief washing over her. "What will happen now?" Eastwood asked. "Will there be consequences for the stewardess?" Captain Davis sighed. "I'll need to file a report when we land. There will be an investigation. As for the immediate situation," he paused, thinking, "I believe a change in crew assignments is appropriate." Just then, Diane, the chief stewardess, approached. She looked concerned when she saw Jessica sitting in first class. "Captain, is everything all right?" she asked. "No, Diane, everything is not all right," Captain Davis replied firmly. "I've been hearing about a troubling incident involving Karen and this young lady." Diane shifted uncomfortably. There was a misunderstanding about blanket availability. "Was there?" the captain asked, his voice sharpening. "Or was there an unacceptable display of prejudice from a member of our crew?" Diane's professional mask slipped for a moment, sure at first, but after observing Karen's behavior, Captain Davis nodded. "For the remainder of this flight, I want Karen assigned to service." "Yes, Captain," Diane replied. She turned to Jessica. "Miss, I apologize for not addressing this situation sooner." Jessica nodded, accepting the apology but still feeling the sting of what had happened. Eastwood watched this exchange with approval. "Justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing," he said. "It's about making things right." Captain Davis stood up. "Miss Williams, would you like to return to your seat in economy, or would you prefer to stay here in first class for the remainder of the flight?" Jessica hesitated. The comfortable leather seat was tempting, but she thought of Margaret, who had shown her kindness when others hadn't. The remainder of the flight passed peacefully. Jessica and Margaret sat in first class, both women still somewhat amazed by this unexpected turn of events. The large, comfortable seats were a far cry from their economy spots, and Susan brought them warm cookies and drinks with friendly smiles. "I never thought I'd sit up here," Margaret whispered to Jessica, running her hand over the smooth leather armrest. "In all my years of flying, I've walked past these seats but never sat in one." Jessica nodded. "Me too. It's like being in another world." Across the aisle, Clint Eastwood had returned to reading his script, occasionally making notes in the margins. Every now and then, he would glance up and give them a small nod or smile. He didn't make a big show of what he had done. That wasn't his style, both on screen and off. In the back of the plane, Karen had been confined to the galley area, arranging food trays and avoiding eye contact with other crew members. The news of what had happened had spread among the flight attendants, creating a tense atmosphere in the crew areas. As the plane began its descent into New York, Captain Davis made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing at JFK Airport in approximately 20 minutes. The weather in New York is clear with a temperature of 72 degrees. On behalf of the entire crew, I want to thank you for flying with us today." There was a brief pause before he continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "I also want to express my commitment that every passenger on this aircraft deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background. That is our airline's policy, and it's also simply the right thing to do." A murmur spread through the cabin. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier incident nodded in approval. Some even applauded briefly. Jessica felt her cheeks warm with emotion. The captain's words meant more to her than he could know. As the plane taxied to the gate after landing, Eastwood finally spoke directly to Jessica and Margaret. "Where are you headed in New York?" he asked casually, as if they were old friends. "I'm visiting my grandmother in Harlem," Jessica replied. "It's her 70th birthday tomorrow." Eastwood nodded. "That's nice. Family is important." "What about you, Mr. Eastwood?" Margaret asked. "What brings you to New York?" "Meetings about a new film," he answered simply. "Nothing as meaningful as a grandmother's birthday." When the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers began gathering their belongings. In economy class, people craned their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of Eastwood and the young woman he had defended. As they prepared to leave the plane, Captain Davis emerged from the cockpit. He approached Jessica with a business card in hand. "Miss Williams," he said, "I'd like you to have this. It has my name and contact information. When you return to Los Angeles, please call the number. I want to make sure you have a pleasant flight home." Jessica accepted the card with a thank you. "I'll also be filing a formal report about today's incident," the captain continued, his voice low but firm. "The airline needs to know what happened. It may be helpful if you're willing to provide a statement as well." Jessica hesitated. She hadn't expected this. Part of her just wanted to forget the whole thing and enjoy her visit with her grandmother. Eastwood seemed to sense her uncertainty. Sometimes standing up for what's right means following through, even when it's uncomfortable, he said quietly. "Your experience might help make sure this doesn't happen to someone else." Margaret nodded in agreement. "He's right, honey. Our people have stayed quiet too long about these things." Jessica thought about it for a moment, then looked at Captain Davis. "I'll provide a statement," she said with new determination. As passengers began to exit the plane, Diane approached their row. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, "there are some photographers at the gate. Word got out that you're on this flight." Eastwood nodded, unsurprised. "Thanks for the warning." He turned to Jessica and Margaret. "Would you ladies prefer to exit before me or after? If you go after, the photographers probably won't pay much attention to you." Jessica smiled at his thoughtfulness. "After would be good. I'm not looking for attention." When it was time to leave, Eastwood shook hands with both women. "It was a pleasure meeting you both, though I wish it had been under different circumstances." "Thank you for what you did," Jessica said, meaning every word. Eastwood shrugged slightly. "I just did what anyone should do when they see something wrong." As he walked down the aisle toward the exit, passengers watched him with new respect. This wasn't just the tough guy from the movies. This was a man who lived by the principles his characters often fought for. 5 days later, Jessica sat in her grandmother's small but cozy Harlem apartment, helping her pack away birthday decorations. The celebration had been wonderful. Family members from across the country had gathered to honor Grandma Liza's 70 years. There had been music, dancing, and enough food to feed twice their number. "You're quiet today, child," Grandma Liza said, folding a colorful tablecloth with practiced hands. "Something on your mind?" Jessica looked up from the stack of cards she was organizing. "Just thinking about the flight here, Grandma." "Ah, yes, the famous movie star who stood up for my granddaughter." Eliza smiled proudly. "You told that story 3 times already." "I still can't believe it happened," Jessica admitted. "Things like that don't happen to ordinary people like me." "There's nothing ordinary about you, Jessica Williams," her grandmother said firmly. "Never was, never will be." The telephone rang, interrupting their conversation. Eliza answered it, then held out the receiver to Jessica with raised eyebrows. "It's for you, a man named Captain Davis." Jessica took the phone, surprised. "Hello. Miss Williams, this is Captain Robert Davis from your flight to New York. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "No, sir. My grandmother's birthday celebration ended yesterday. We're just cleaning up." "Wonderful. I'm calling because there have been some developments I thought you should know about." Jessica sat down on the worn sofa, her heart beating faster. "What kind of developments?" "The airline has completed its initial investigation into what happened on our flight. Karen Mercer has been suspended pending a formal hearing. But that's not the most important reason I'm calling." Jessica waited, listening intently. A reporter from the New York Times somehow heard about what happened. Apparently, someone on the plane called them. They're interested in writing a story about it. Jessica's stomach tightened. "A newspaper story? About me?" "About the incident, yes. They're especially interested in Mr. Eastwood's involvement. The reporter asked if you would be willing to be interviewed." Jessica didn't know what to say. She had never expected this kind of attention. "You don't have to decide right now," Captain Davis continued. "But I should tell you that Mr. Eastwood has already spoken with them briefly. He confirmed what happened but directed most of the focus toward the larger issue of discrimination in public transportation." Jessica thought for a moment. "Would my name be in the newspaper?" "They would like to include it, yes, but that's entirely up to you." After the call ended, Jessica explained everything to her grandmother. Eliza listened thoughtfully, her wise eyes never leaving her granddaughter's face. "What do you think I should do, Grandma?" Eliza took Jessica's hands in her own. "When I was your age, we couldn't even sit at the front of a bus, let alone fly in airplanes. Things have changed, but not enough. Your story might help change more minds." 2 days later, Jessica sat in a small cafe near Central Park, facing a young reporter named Sarah Jenkins. The interview lasted nearly an hour. Jessica described everything that had happened on the flight, trying to be fair and accurate. "And what was your impression of Mr. Eastwood?" Sarah asked, her pencil poised over her notebook. Jessica considered the question carefully. "He didn't make a big show of helping me. He just did what he thought was right. He used his power to help someone who didn't have any." The story appeared in the Sunday edition of the New York Times with the headline, "Hollywood Star Stands Against Discrimination at 30,000 Feet." It wasn't on the front page, but it wasn't buried either. The article described the incident and quoted both Jessica and Eastwood. It also mentioned that the airline had suspended the stewardess involved and was reviewing its training procedures. As Jessica flew back to Los Angeles the following week, she was treated with special attention by the flight crew. Captain Davis had arranged for her to fly first class. This time, when she asked for a blanket, 3 different flight attendants rushed to bring her one. Back at her community college, Jessica's story made her briefly famous. Friends and classmates asked for details about meeting Clint Eastwood. But as the weeks passed, the excitement faded and life returned mostly to normal. What didn't return to normal was Jessica herself. The experience had changed something inside her. And somewhere in Hollywood, though he rarely spoke about it, Clint Eastwood would occasionally think about the young woman on that flight and hope she was doing well. Not because he saw himself as a hero, but because sometimes doing the right thing creates ripples that travel much further than we can see.